The chief executive officer of Netflix just said under oath that James Gunn's Superman movie was a failure, or at least that's what a bunch of websites and videos are saying about it. Where are they getting this information from? From the recent hearing that Ted Sarandos, chief executive officer of Netflix, had with the United States Senate, where they discussed whether Netflix should complete its merger with Warner Brothers or not. Is the information real? In this video, we examine the original news source. I'll tell you all the context of what's happening and compare the numbers and performance of James Gunn's Superman movie with other films. To make the data more meaningful, let's start. A quick clarification before starting this video. I know that the Superman fandom is very divided. There are those who are huge fans of James Gunn and don't like anything negative being said about anything that comes out of the Detective Comics universe. And on the other hand, there are people who are huge fans of Snyder, and they don't tolerate any criticism of his movies. The reality is that both have positive and negative aspects, like any other director. You know, I liked Man of Steel, I liked the last Superman movie. I'll be as impartial as possible presenting this information so you can form your own opinion based on the facts. Well, let's try to keep an open mind, and now let's get into the context of the situation. This session you're watching, the one that's gone so viral, it's a hearing where several United States senators are questioning Ted Sarandos, the chief executive officer of Netflix, to determine whether or not the purchase of Warner Brothers should go through. You may have seen in the news that Netflix bought Warner, but it's important to know the deal hasn't happened yet. Netflix has already made the offer and Warner has accepted it. But since this is the merger of two such big companies, the United States government has to decide whether or not to allow them to go through with the deal. But why? You're probably wondering, don't they live in a free market country where everyone can buy and sell freely? I mean, yes, but not really. Even highly capitalist countries like the United States have antitrust laws to stop companies from taking up too large a share. Why? Because eventually big companies become huge, and this means that no other company can compete with them, which, well, is bad for consumers. In this session then, different senators, both Republicans and Democrats, asked Ted Sarandos several questions so they can decide whether or not to allow him to go through with this purchase. And something very important you need to know about these sessions is that the answers are given under oath, which means that if someone lies during these sessions, they could be accused of something called perjury, which is considered a serious crime that, depending on the case and the place, can be punished with fines or even prison. Hey, but before we get to that part, let me remind you that this week is my course on the history of superheroes. It's an online course, completely live with me, consisting of 4 sessions where we talk about how superheroes started, how they evolved over the years, and how they became the icons we know today. We discuss how Superman and Captain America were once used as nationalist propaganda, and how later writers reimagined them in protest stories. We cover everything from the mythological references in comics to topics from James Gunn's DC universe, so it's completely up to date. The sessions are recorded so you can watch them again. You'll receive all materials as PDFs and a guide to the top comics from each era. These are our schedules, with the final session running longer so we can hang out and chat.
Ask him directly, will this be an exclusive theatrical release for a few days?
Yes, exclusively in theaters.
Will this be self-enforced? In other words, if you fall short of that...
It is the industry standard for self-enforcement. However, for underperforming movies, the window often shifts. Superman had a shorter window while Sinners had a longer one. They could still call it a 45-day window.
To really understand what they're discussing, we need to look back a few minutes, something usually left out of this hearing. At this point in the session, Senator Cory Booker told Ted Sarandos that Congress had received many letters from actors' organizations, writers' unions, and movie theater shareholders. Without specifying, asking Congress to reject the purchase of Warner by Netflix and by Paramount, these groups I mentioned are therefore opposed to Warner being bought by both Netflix and Paramount. Why? Because they want Warner to remain an independent studio, which I think is difficult. So Cory asked Ted a question that I consider very valid. He asked him, why are all these people who clearly know about film afraid of the fact that Netflix might buy Warner? The chief executive officer of Netflix answered that he believes these fears are because cinema has been under attack. That was the term he used during the last 5 years. Since events like the pandemic, the writers' strike, and the drop in production levels have affected the movie business. He also says there's nothing to worry about, as Netflix has grown despite these factors, and promises the company will protect its interests. That's something I would question, especially because Netflix has been involved in some controversies for not wanting to pay actors and writers certain royalties. But anyway, this is what he said, and yes, it was under oath, but his comments were ambiguous enough that nothing will happen. I mean, yes, he did say it under oath, that they were going to look after the interests of those involved in the film industry, but he didn't say what specific actions he would take to protect those interests or how he was going to do it. That's something very common in these hearings, where people avoid saying anything concrete or answering questions with a yes or no, precisely to avoid being prosecuted for perjury later on. And this was when the famous 45-day window was mentioned for the first time, which is supposedly the amount of time movies have to wait after their theatrical release before they can be available for digital rental and streaming platforms. So, this general rule for theatrical movies says that if you release a movie today, you have to wait 45 days before you can put it up for sale, for rent, or on any streaming service. This is so that people are encouraged to watch movies in theaters. The theory is that if this 45-day window is eliminated, many people will prefer to watch movies at home instead of going to the theaters. Which isn't good for the movie business since much of the revenue comes from the box office. It's worth mentioning that, according to Deadline, Ted Sarandos originally wanted a 17-day window. Just imagine a movie comes out in theaters today and in about 2 weeks you already have it at home. But many people related to the film industry were very much against this, so Ted said that Netflix would commit to a 45-day window. Here's where the Superman part comes in. The senator asked Ted Sarandos, Netflix's chief executive officer, "Hey, really? Is it going to be a mandatory 45 days? I mean, are you committing that no matter what happens it will be 45 days here?" What the senator was looking for was a clear answer, a yes or a no, precisely to avoid those ambiguities I mentioned to you. And here, Ted Sarandos said something very true, that this 45-day practice is not something that works for all movies. It's more of an estimate, which can vary depending on the box office of each film. This is where this famous clip comes in. And if we check the theatrical and digital release dates of the movies Ted Sarandos talked about, he was right, he didn't lie. Since the Superman movie was released in theaters on July 11, 2025, while its digital release was on August 15, which means there was a 35-day window instead of 45. Sinners, on the other hand, was released in theaters on April 18 and came out digitally on June 3, which gives us a 47-day window instead of 45. But does this really match what we see at the box office? We have to remember that each production has a different budget and different expectations. But the general rule used in entertainment journalism is that for a movie to be profitable, it has to triple its production cost. This is because besides the budget that companies spend on making the movie, they also spend a good amount on marketing and distribution. A portion of the box office goes to the theaters and so on. So if a movie costs 100 million, the studio expects that movie to make at least 300 million. In the case of Superman, by James Gunn, the budget was $225 million, while the final box office was $616 million. That is $59 million less than what was expected. Sinners, on the other hand, cost $95 million and made $368, which is almost 4 times its budget. So, well, does that mean the Superman movie was a failure? Not necessarily, because that's not the whole story. First of all, because all these anti-James Gunn pages are saying that Ted Sarandos said Superman was a failure, which isn't true. And I can rewind the clip so you can see it. He said it performed below expectations, which isn't the same, though some will always twist things, especially since Superman nearly tripled its production cost. Interestingly, we find a very similar case with the movie Man of Steel, since it was also a film that cost $225 million and made $670 million at the box office. Which means it was also a bit below tripling its budget, although it's also true that it was closer than James Gunn's Superman. If you claim James Gunn's Superman movie failed by these standards, you'd also have to admit Man of Steel wasn't much better. The difference wasn't significant. But what do you think? It turns out that, according to several reports, both James Gunn's Superman and Man of Steel were profitable and lucrative. In the case of Man of Steel, the film had an extra income of $170 million from advertising deals, as reported by The Hollywood Reporter in 2013. In addition, Greg Silverman, former chief executive officer of Warner, confirmed in a tweet that all the movies Zack Snyder made for Warner were profitable, with the exception of Guardians of the Ghoul and Sucker Punch. And for example, Watchmen was indeed a box office failure, but it recovered a lot through physical format sales, which did very well. Superman by James Gunn. On the other hand, it also had several deals with brands like Toyota, Spotify, dog food, and a Forbes article said that the film had generated $100 million in profit for Warner. And here I want to talk to you about something important in an ideal world. This would be good news because it means that Superman movies, a character we like, are profitable. Unfortunately, I'm sure that many people aren't happy to see both movies succeed, but instead do everything they can to make the other one look like a failure. But it's tough for either side to do that without hurting themselves. First, both movies had similar box office results. Second, if you trust The Hollywood Reporter and Greg Silverman, why not believe Forbes too? Do you see what I mean? To criticize the other side, you need to selectively believe certain information and ignore the rest. But, like I've said in other videos, my favorite Superman movie sold more. Does that just mean it sold more? I understand that a lot of people want to justify their personal tastes with box office numbers, but we should also ask ourselves if what's most popular is always the best, right? Ultimately, we can enjoy whatever we want without worrying about the box office like shareholders. And if we're true fans of Superman, I think the most important thing is to understand the meaning of his stories and try to treat each other with respect and empathy. That's surely what Superman would want. What matters is that now you're fully informed with all the context of the news, so no one can try to give you false information. And if you want to keep up with all this superhero news with context, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It's free and it really helps us a lot. Remember, my superhero history course starts this week. Find the link and discount coupon in the video description. That's all for now. I'm Go the Geek Monitor, and keep looking beyond the obvious.